Hi, my name is Tim Weber, and today I want to talk to you about geothermal, which is the hottest trend in new rentals. So a little history on Diverso Energy. Prior to 2014, we were an engineering firm operating for about a decade, and in 2014, we founded Diverso Energy with the intent to be a full-service geothermal utility provider where we design, build, own, and operate geothermal assets. April of 2023, we were acquired by Diff Capital Partners, and since then we have turned into a full-service geothermal design, build, construct. All aspects of construction are now in-house and working with developers across the Greater Toronto area. So if we take a step back and look at where the real estate market is as a whole right now, no surprise to anyone, it looks a lot different than it did 5 years ago. And I think this all started with rising construction costs, which were compounded by supply chain issues. And then post-COVID, we saw significant interest rate increases, which impacted, obviously construction costs themselves, construction financing, long-term takeout financing, and then also the absorption rate for condos as buyers can no longer afford to purchase condos. And on top of that, there's a looming carbon tax, which nobody really knows where that's going to go, but still a long-term threat. And through all of this, we saw the transition where we were, maybe an 80-20 condo to rental market. Now I think it's the inverse. We've seen a lot of condo projects that have been converted to rentals just for financial reasons, a little bit more certainty. And also because of the lifeline thrown out by the federal government in the form of the CMHC MLI Select financing, which really allowed these rental opportunities to actually make sense for the proformas to work. And without that, the proformas just did not work, and we're seeing stranded projects that were just not going to market. So as much as the MLI Select program is a lifeline, you still need to qualify. And what does that mean? And I think you can break it down into three main categories. There's affordability, which obviously is a challenge. There's energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reductions, and to hit the full, to get the full 100-point distribution to maximize your, your financing benefits, you need to be 40% above building code or 40% above business as usual. Third option is, or the third requirement is accessibility. And if we look at those three combined to get to that 100 points, to get the full benefit, because you have longer amortization, less equity required, loan to value ratio is increased. These are all things that are very sacred to you as a development community to make these projects work, for them to pencil out and to actually move forward. So how does geothermal impact these things? Well, it impacts number two, and that's energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reductions, which is probably the biggest nut anyway. And geothermal as one technology, not only do you get to that 40%, in most cases, you're meeting it and exceeding it by a significant amount. So geothermal is a market-ready solution, and I think that's something I can say now with confidence. The market in Toronto has changed significantly. The industry has changed. It's evolved. In fact, I've traveled all over North America, and there's nowhere in Canada, the United States, where there's a full turnkey market-ready solution for multi-residential, high-density urban buildings like we're seeing in Toronto. And it's been a long time in the making. The timing is perfect as we as an industry have been ramping up over the last decade. We're now in a position to meet this new demand, which is caused by, these three things: 40% requirement for MLI Select, municipal standards such as the Toronto Green Standard. It's now transitioned into version 4, which is finally that point that's sort of moving the needle. It's driving a shift from business as usual, a departure from the norm, creating some problems for developers and consultants alike, trying to meet these new aggressive standards, and conventional envelopes, conventional heating and cooling equipment's not getting there. So you need something that'll bring you over that threshold, and that something is geothermal. So not only meeting these new carbon and energy targets, which solves an immediate problem, which is how do we get through construction? How do we get this building to start? Then there's also the long-term benefits. And I think in the rental space, everything's measured by NOI, net operating income. There's a few ways of improving your NOI. One is to reduce your cost, reducing your operating cost and your construction costs. Reducing construction costs is a challenge. So how do you reduce your operating costs? And there's different ways. We're seeing more projects that are downloading energy costs onto tenants, getting it off balance sheet. But there's also things like maintenance, repairs, and capital reserve. And when you own boilers and you own cooling towers, those require maintenance, those require repairs, those require capital reserve for future replacement. It's a depreciable asset. And because geothermal eliminates the needs for that equipment, it also eliminates the costs associated with that equipment. And by that NOI increase also increases building valuation using, whatever cap rate metric you want to use, increased NOI, increased valuation. And I think, there's soft benefits beyond just the NOI. There's, you'd be hard pressed to find a REIT in the market now that's not focused on low carbon buildings. They do not want to own long-term assets that do not align with long-term policy, long-term, whether it be internal metrics they're trying to meet, ESG targets. There's internal and external pressures demanding that their assets are future-proofed, low carbon, and ready for net zero, if not there already. So not only will they potentially pay more trying to offload a building that's not already transitioned, that's not been electrified, transitioning away from fossil fuel, could become a problem in the future. And the nice thing about geothermal is doing it pre-construction is a whole lot easier than trying to retrofit down the road. It's important to have options. And prior to 2014, prior to starting this utility model, there really was one option for geothermal. It was hire an engineer to design the system, put it out for tender, hire a driller, and kind of cross your fingers it all comes together during construction, and cross your fingers it meets the energy and cooling needs of the building long term. Well, that's no longer the only option on the table. It still is an option, but there's better options. Option one is the zero cost utility model, which is sort of the bread and butter of our business, where we take on all of that responsibility, designing it, building it, constructing it, operating it, guaranteeing that performance long term. Essentially take all the negatives off the plate and leave behind the positives, which is the carbon energy, the branding, the bragging rights, the cachet that goes with the low carbon building, meeting your ESG targets. Those things remain. The risks and costs are eliminated. And then there's a bit of a hybrid between the two, and that's the design build model, where we would still take responsibility for the execution and the design, but ultimately the asset is on the developer's balance sheet. It's still ultimately their responsibility to build it, their responsibility to operate it, whereas we act as an agent to provide that, design build turnkey solution. And there's no real right or wrong. There's nuances to every project that are unique, nuances to the business model of each project that are unique. So it's important, I think as an industry, we try to tailor the business model to meet the specific business objectives, energy objectives on a per project basis. Other long-term upsides, there's carbon reduction. A typical multi-residential building, 200 to 300,000 square feet, 200 to 300 units. You're seeing an average of about 300 tons of carbon reduction, which is incredibly significant, especially considering that's just coming from one technology. 2 to 4 million liters of water reduced, incredible environmental impact. And with that goes the chemical treatment that's also associated with cooling towers. And then there's the 30-year net occupancy savings. And I think the net occupancy in the 30 years, the significance there is long-term certainty, cost certainty. If you think of a typical building, everything's a variable. The cost to maintain the building is a variable. The cost of trades, access to trades, interest rates, even rental income is a variable based on market conditions. Future policies are a variable. The nice thing about geothermal, once it's in, whether it's a debt service or a utility charge, that's a predictable charge, a predictable rate where there's cost certainty for 30 years, which is a luxury rarely seen in commercial real estate. The other nice thing is you get a technology that's so significant in so many ways, but it's out of sight, out of mind. It's not like nothing against solar panels, but solar panels are on the roof. You need to find room for them. You need to deal with that. This is a piece of equipment and infrastructure that's buried underneath the building, pre-construction. It's 600 to 800 feet deep. You don't see it. You don't have to deal with it. You don't need space for it. It doesn't encumber the land in any way. It really has no negative impact on the building whatsoever. It's really all just a positive impact. And the other thing too with that is because it's underneath the building and because it's made out of high density polyethylene pipe, which is the same pipe that gas companies use to transport natural gas, it will outlast the building. It's designed for an 80 to 150 year life cycle. It doesn't get impacted by UV rays. It's under the building. It can't be fractured. It can't be damaged. It's protected. Can't be drilled into or hit by an excavator. It will literally outlast the building. So what are the alternatives? I think there are alternatives, and as I mentioned earlier, every building is unique. And is geothermal the right fit for everything? No, I think it's the right fit for most buildings. Sometimes smaller buildings, 20 to 30 unit buildings, might be a better fit for air source VRF. It may be a very viable, practical option as opposed to geothermal. The other option, if you were highly opposed to geothermal, you could meet the MLI Select, and you could probably meet the Toronto Green Standard through envelope and other equipment upgrades. The challenge with that is it's obviously incredibly expensive. You're probably now getting into the realm of some pretty complicated out-of-the-box pieces of equipment, which may create an operating issue down the road just through complexity. But even if you do meet those targets, what you're not going to do is future-proof the building, because a building where the energy efficiency is achieved through the envelope is still burning fossil fuel. And ultimately, the point of MLI Select and the Toronto Green Standard, it's all about the energy transition from fossil fuel to electrification and being done in a very effective, efficient way. And putting in punched windows does not eliminate natural gas. So it's not going to help you with the future proofing. It's not going to be a building that's attractive to a REIT. It's not going to help you reduce your operational maintenance and repairs and capital reserve payments. So it's not going to help your NOI. It's a short-term solution with no long-term benefit. There's a hybrid solution, which is really the only viable option for tall buildings. The 60-story buildings with small lots where there's just not enough physical space to put in enough bore field or enough boreholes to address the entire energy needs of the building. So in that case, we look at a hybrid, cooling towers handling the peak cooling, boilers handling the peak heating. You still meet the MLI Select, you still meet the TGS, you still get a significant 60 to 70% natural gas reduction, carbon reduction, but working within the confines of a small property and a tall building. And that is it. Thank you very much for your time.